The morning mist clung to the deck of the Zuikaku like ghostly silk, soft and pale against the cold steel. A Japanese sailor, binoculars pressed to his eyes, squinted at the horizon. The ocean was calm, unnervingly calm, broken only by the distant hum of aircraft engines somewhere beyond the gray veil. He chuckled, shaking his head. "America no baka," he muttered. "Foolish Americans." Through his lens, the shape emerged. A massive, lumbering aircraft carrier, a floating warehouse of steel and arrogance. To him, it was absurd. Too large, too slow, too dependent on its machines and its crews of inexperienced boys. He laughed again, unaware that the shape in his glass, an Essex-class carrier, would soon outlive his navy, his ship, and his empire. It was December 1942, and the Pacific was still a Japanese ocean. After Pearl Harbor, after the fall of Singapore, and after the humiliation of the U.S. fleet at the hands of Yamamoto's rising empire, the Japanese Navy saw itself as invincible. Its carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, had defined the new age of naval war. To the Imperial Command, the Americans were clumsy imitators, still fumbling with machines they didn't understand. The phrase whispered across radio intercepts and intelligence reports was mocking, "Hotel carriers. Ships so bloated with men and machinery they must serve cocktails instead of commands." But on the other side of the ocean, in the biting Atlantic wind of Norfolk, Virginia, something colossal was being born in secret. Riveters hammered, sparks fell like stars, and floodlights glared against half-assembled hulls. Shipwrights worked through nights that smelled of oil and sea salt, shaping something America had never attempted before. An entire class of fleet carriers, the Essex-class, designed to be built not one by one, but in waves. 24 of them, identical, replaceable, mass-produced. It was an idea so industrial, so unlike the craftsmanship of the Japanese naval tradition, that Tokyo refused to believe it was possible. The USS Essex, CV-9, slipped into the water in July 1942, months after Midway had shattered Japan's illusions of eternal victory, and months before the Americans could even replace the losses they had taken. It was massive, over 870 feet long, displacing more than 27,000 tons, with a flight deck that could host nearly 100 aircraft. To some in the U.S. Navy, it looked excessive, even reckless. One officer joked, "It's not a ship. It's a city with a rudder." Others whispered darker things. "Too big, too slow. One torpedo and she'll sink like a rock." The Essex didn't answer. It simply steamed forward into the dawn, her steel hull cutting through the Atlantic swell like a promise. Below deck, young sailors found their new home intimidating. Everything echoed. Machinery rumbled through the night. The smell of aviation fuel never left the air. Planes were stacked, armed, fueled, and launched with a rhythm that was more factory than fleet. And yet, even amid the noise and confusion, there was purpose. America wasn't building ships anymore. It was building systems. At first, the Japanese didn't care. Their admirals laughed in polished mess halls, sipping tea and reviewing intercepted American communications about the Essex program. They compared it to a child boasting about owning a fleet of castles in the clouds. "You cannot mass-produce warriors," Admiral Agaki said. "The soul of battle cannot be stamped out in a factory." Around the table, the officers nodded. They believed in discipline, spirit, and precision, the things America, in their eyes, lacked. But somewhere in the Pacific, a single Essex carrier floated like a steel island of defiance. Its pilots were young, some barely 20, and its crew made mistakes. Planes crashed on landing. Fuel lines ruptured. Deck fires broke out. Yet the ship endured. Every mistake was recorded, every error studied, every process refined. And from that refinement came speed, the kind of speed that doesn't just launch planes faster but learns faster. Meanwhile, Japan's victories began to stall. Guadalcanal bled them dry. The Yamato, their super battleship, stood useless without air cover. And still, their officers mocked the Americans' new carriers. Floating barns, they called them. Targets so large even a blind man could hit them. They had no idea that by the end of 1943, The Essex-class ships would be launching hundreds of aircraft each day, replenished faster than the Japanese could sink them. The ocean itself seemed to favor irony. One morning in early 1943, as the USS Essex cut through Pacific waters under a sunrise the color of gunmetal, her crew intercepted a Japanese propaganda broadcast. A voice crackled over the static, cheerful, derisive, confident. It said that America was hiding behind its giant ships, afraid to meet honorable warriors face to face. The men in the ready room listened in silence. Then one of them, a mechanic named Andrews from Ohio, spat his tobacco and said quietly, "We'll see who hides." They would. But not yet. For now they trained. Day after day, catapults slammed, arresting cables screeched, and pilots risked their lives learning how to land on a moving runway in crosswinds. The Essex shook with every launch, her engines humming like a living heart. A young ensign wrote in his journal, "The ship breathes with us. When she turns, we lean with her. When she burns, we burn with her." From above, the carrier looked monstrous. A flat, gray beast gliding through blue infinity. From below, in her engine rooms, men worked shirtless in the heat, drenched in sweat, feeding her boilers with oil and willpower. They were far from home, but home had become the steel around them. Every clang of a hammer, every rush of steam, every roar of an engine was a heartbeat in a giant body built not for elegance but endurance. The Japanese called it arrogance. The Americans called it necessity. By late 1943, whispers of the Essex-class began to reach the Japanese fleet. Reports described multiple identical carriers appearing in different battle zones, one off Wake Island, another near the Gilberts, a third striking the Marshalls. Confusion spread. How could the Americans have built so many, so quickly? Tokyo dismissed it as deception. But the truth was far worse. It wasn't a trick. It was production. Inside Japan's war ministry, the laughter began to sound nervous. Admiral Kasaka, reviewing reconnaissance photos, frowned. "They are not the same ship," he said softly. "They are many." But that realization came too late for the men who had laughed first. Back aboard the Zuikaku, the same sailor who once mocked the hotel carrier now stood watching smoke columns rise from distant waves. His comrades' ships, Shokaku, Hyo Taiho, were gone, turned into twisted iron tombs. He squinted again at the horizon. The shape was there once more, massive, unyielding, sending wave after wave of aircraft that darkened the sky. He no longer laughed. Somewhere over the Pacific, the engines of the Essex screamed into the clouds, carrying vengeance information. They had called it a hotel. Soon it would become a storm. The laughter would die somewhere between the waves and the sky. And when it did, the Pacific would belong to the ship they said could never survive. They mocked America's floating cities, until those cities erased their empire. The laughter died somewhere in the Pacific. The Essex wasn't just a ship. It was vengeance forged in steel. In the months that followed the Essex's first silent patrol, the myth of invincibility that had once cloaked the Japanese Navy began to thin like morning fog. Yet on the American side, there was no triumph, only exhaustion and uncertainty. The Pacific was still vast, cruel, and indifferent. The men aboard the Essex-class carriers lived in constant noise, a grinding, metallic thunder that never ceased. Steel bulkheads trembled. Jet fuel stung the air. Deck crews shouted through wind and smoke, their words swallowed by the roar of engines and catapult blasts. To outsiders, the Essex seemed perfect, unstoppable. But inside her hull, the truth was chaos barely tamed by discipline. Every launch was a gamble. Every landing was a miracle. During early operations, the carrier decks became graveyards of twisted propellers and torn fuselages. Pilots misjudged crosswinds. Hooks missed cables. Some skidded off the bow and vanished into the sea before rescue crews could even react. The sailors on deck would turn away, their faces blank. They couldn't afford grief. The next plane was already lining up to land. Below them, in the hangar decks, mechanics worked through sleepless nights repairing what little came back. Every spark of a welding torch felt like defiance. The U.S. Navy was learning on the fly, literally. The Essex carriers were new, immense, and untested in prolonged war. Their crews were young, their officers often barely older. Admiral Mark Mitcher, a quiet, sharp-eyed leader known for his unrelenting standards, began shaping them into something the world had never seen before. A synchronized machine of sea, sky, and industry. "We will not fight like the Japanese," he said. "We will fight like Americans, with precision and mass." He meant it. Under his direction, the carrier task forces became floating production lines of destruction. Each Essex could launch for strike waves in a single day, something no other navy could dream of. But getting there came at a brutal cost. Deck fires erupted after failed takeoffs. Hydraulic systems jammed. Fuel lines burst under pressure. At Pearl Harbor's repair docks, returning Essex ships looked like wounded titans, charred decks, twisted elevators, gaping holes from near-miss bombs. Crews patched them up and sent them back into battle, often within weeks. The Japanese command called it madness. The Americans called it momentum. At home, factories in Brooklyn, Newport News, and San Francisco worked under floodlights that never went dark. The clang of metal rang through the night as welders and riveters built more Essex-class hulls, faster than anyone had believed possible. It wasn't heroism anymore, it was math. For every carrier lost, 2 more would soon join the fleet. This was the revelation that began to terrify Japan's strategists. The Americans had turned war into an equation. Back on deck, the struggle was human. Young pilots, fresh from training, learned that no textbook could prepare them for the Pacific's shifting winds or the terror of seeing the deck rush toward them at 100 knots. In those early months, every successful landing felt like a prayer answered. Lieutenant William "Red" Evans remembered his first night approach. The deck was pitch black except for a faint strip of light along the edge. My hands shook so bad I couldn't feel the stick. I hit too hard, blew a tire, and skidded sideways. When the crew ran over, I was laughing like a fool. I wasn't brave. I was just alive. Every survivor learned. Every mistake taught a lesson. The Essex program became a crucible where failure forged competence. Each mission refined the choreography. Deck handlers guiding planes with illuminated wands, armorers loading bombs with mechanical precision, radio officers relaying coded messages that stitched together chaos into control. It was no longer the romantic image of gallant captains and dueling ships. It was something colder, smarter, and far more dangerous: the weaponization of efficiency. Meanwhile, Japan's once proud naval air arm began to fracture. The Empire's shipyards, stretched across occupied territory, lacked the resources to replace what was lost. Oil convoys from the Dutch East Indies were hunted down by American submarines. Pilots, once elite and meticulously trained, were rushed into service with barely enough fuel for practice flights. Their Zero fighters remained nimble and elegant, but their pilots no longer were. The Imperial Navy still believed in spirit. The Americans now believed in systems. One of those systems was logistics, the invisible miracle behind every Essex victory. Fleet oilers shadowed the carriers, refueling them mid-ocean. Floating supply ships carried spare parts, food, and ammunition, replenishing the fleet without ever returning to port. For the first time in history, a navy had become self-sustaining at sea. The Japanese command didn't understand how the Americans could stay out there for months. They assumed the carriers would have to retreat. They never did. The USS Essex herself faced her first trial in September 1943, striking Marcus Island. It wasn't a major battle, but it was a test of everything: timing, coordination, and nerve. At dawn, aircraft engines thundered as waves of Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless dive bombers took off into a clouded sky. Pilots reported anti-aircraft bursts like black flowers blooming beneath them. One plane was hit on the first run. Another exploded on takeoff. The deck was slick with oil and blood, but the attacks continued, relentless and precise. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Island's airfields were cratered ruins. When the Essex's pilots returned, their hands shook as they climbed from their cockpits. Some collapsed onto the deck, kissing the steel beneath them. They had done it not perfectly, but enough. The Essex had survived her baptism. The men who had once feared her size now trusted it. The laughter from Tokyo broadcasts began to fade, replaced by unease. Below deck, Chief Engineer Robert Hayes watched the ship's engines hum at full power. He said later, "She sounded alive. The boilers roared like lungs. It was the first time I thought, maybe this ship will outlast the war." But the cost never stopped. Each victory brought more names on casualty lists, more telegrams sent home. Every Essex-class ship bore scars, melted paint from bomb blasts, dented armor plates, and the faint smell of fire that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Even in triumph, the men understood the price of their progress. By early 1944, Admiral Mitcher began to see the full picture. The Essex carriers were not just ships, they were nodes in a network of speed and power. When combined, they could project more force in a single day than Japan's entire fleet. But Mitcher's eyes carried the weight of the cost. He wrote in his diary, "Power without discipline is chaos. We are racing against time and against ourselves." That race took a toll. Crews rotated faster than replacements could learn. Pilots suffered exhaustion, nerves stretched to breaking. Some cracked under the pressure, others simply vanished, missing in action, their last words carried by radio static. Yet the machine did not stop. The Essex fleet, now growing monthly, advanced across the Pacific like a tide that refused to turn. One night, during a lull in operations, a sailor leaned against the railing of the flight deck, staring at the horizon. Lightning flickered on the clouds ahead. He whispered to a friend, "They said we'd never match their navy. Now they're the ones running out of ocean." The other man didn't answer. He just nodded, the wind whipping through his hair as the carrier steamed toward another dawn. The Japanese had once believed they could break America's will with a single decisive strike. What they didn't understand was that America had learned to build its will, bolt by bolt, ship by ship. And now, the Essex-class, the same ships they had mocked, were becoming unstoppable. But the men aboard them didn't yet know how much farther they still had to go, or how many would not return from the storm ahead. The question that hung in the salty air was simple and cold. Would speed and numbers truly be enough to defeat an empire that once ruled the Pacific skies? The storm came in 1944, not of wind and water, but of steel and fire. Across the Pacific, the ocean itself began to change color. No longer the calm blue of Japanese dominion, but streaked with gray wakes of American task forces pushing westward. At the heart of them roared the Essex carriers, their decks trembling under the weight of a war machine now perfected. The laughter that once echoed from Tokyo's radio waves had long since fallen silent. Now only fear carried across the Pacific air. Each Essex was a floating city of momentum, over 3,000 men, nearly 100 aircraft, and the industrial heartbeat of a nation that refused to surrender. When their engines roared together, the sound carried for miles, a low, steady thunder that seemed to pulse with purpose. The fleet was no longer an experiment. It was a doctrine, and that doctrine had one command: take the Pacific back. By the spring of 1944, the Japanese Navy was struggling to hold the line. Its pilots were younger, its fuel reserves dwindling, its radar systems outdated. But in Tokyo, pride still burned hotter than reason. The order went out to prepare for a decisive battle, one that would crush the Americans once and for all. They didn't know that the enemy they mocked 2 years earlier had become a different creature entirely, disciplined, industrialized, and hungry for retribution. The Essex-class carriers spearheaded what was now called Task Force 58. Under Admiral Mark Mitcher, they moved like a storm front. Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, Enterprise, Intrepid, and more, all striking in unison. They no longer operated alone but in groups, each protected by destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. Every movement was timed to seconds, every launch a symphony of logistics and nerve. At dawn, decks blazed with light as planes rolled forward, propellers chopping the humid air. Mechanics waved torches, loaders heaved bombs into bays, and signal officers raised colored flags. When the order came, "Launch!" the carriers unleashed fury. Engines screamed, and one by one, The planes leapt from the decks into the vast Pacific sky. Within minutes, the horizon was filled with specks, hundreds of them, rising into the sun like a swarm of metallic bees. The first major clash came in the skies over the Marianas, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. The Japanese called it Operation Ego, their desperate attempt to stop the American advance. They brought everything they had, 9 carriers, over 400 planes, and the hope that training and tradition could triumph over quantity. But what met them wasn't chaos. It was orchestration. From the bridge of the USS Lexington, Admiral Mitcher watched radar screens light up with approaching enemy formations. His voice was calm. "Launch the Hellcats," he said. Within minutes, waves of Grumman F-6Fs roared into the air, blue-gray hunters with teeth painted on their noses. They climbed into the sun, where the Japanese pilots could not see them, and waited. When the enemy came, it was like watching history collide with the future. The Zero fighters that had once dominated the Pacific met their reckoning. Their agility was still unmatched, but their pilots were outnumbered and outflown. The sky turned into a massacre. Radio chatter filled with clipped voices, "Bandit 11 o'clock high," followed by static and silence. By sunset, the ocean was littered with wreckage. The Americans had destroyed over 370 Japanese aircraft, nearly the entire strength of their carrier air arm, while losing fewer than 30 of their own. It was so one-sided that the U.S. pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On the decks of the Essex carriers, sailors cheered, though the mood was somber beneath the noise. They had seen their enemy die not in courageless retreat, but in futile devotion. One pilot, Lieutenant George Brown, landed after his third sortie that day. His hands shook as he climbed down the ladder. He looked at the deck chief and said, "I saw one of them ram his plane into the sea rather than eject." He didn't flinch. "They'd rather die than lose." The chief nodded quietly. "Then we'd better not lose either." The Essex-class had proven something profound, not just their power, but their permanence. Their massive hangar decks turned into refueling lines. Their elevators shuttled aircraft like clockwork. They could launch 120 planes in an hour, recover them, reload, and send them back out before the Japanese could even regroup. Each Essex was a factory of destruction, efficient, relentless, and tireless. The Japanese admirals watching from afar were horrified. One report from Admiral Toyota read, "They are machines. They do not stop. They do not tire. They build more as we die." Another Japanese pilot's recovered diary found floating in a life raft said, "We fought the sky, but the sky itself seems to belong to them now." From the Marianas, the Essex fleet pushed onward, to the Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa. The ocean boiled with movement. Wherever the carriers went, the Japanese fleet withered. Battleships that had once ruled the seas now hid behind islands, fearful of the American bombers that hunted them from miles away. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Essex-class carriers became the architects of history's largest naval battle. When Japanese forces attempted a final, desperate counterattack, the carriers responded with overwhelming precision. Bombers from Essex, Lexington, and Intrepid rained destruction on ships hundreds of miles away. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, turned back in disgrace, its hull scarred by near misses. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was reduced to fragments. But the Essex carriers paid their price too. USS Franklin was struck by 2 bombs in March 1945, her flight deck engulfed in flame. Over 800 men were killed. Yet the ship refused to die. Her crew fought for hours, sealing off fires, carrying the wounded, and saving the ship through sheer will. When she limped back to Pearl Harbor, burned and twisted, sailors from other ships lined the rails and saluted. She had become a symbol of everything the Essex-class stood for, strength born from endurance. By mid-1945, the numbers told the story. The U.S. Navy had deployed 24 Essex-class carriers. They had launched more than 170,000 combat sorties, dropped millions of pounds of ordnance, and sunk nearly every major Japanese warship. It was industrial annihilation. A nation's factories turned into thunderheads of war. And yet, amid the triumph, There was awe and a hint of unease. Sailors stared at the endless columns of smoke rising from bombed harbors and cities. They realized that the carriers were no longer fighting an enemy. They were erasing one. One night, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Mitcher stood on the bridge of Bunker Hill. The deck below was dark except for the faint glow of red signal lamps guiding home the last of the pilots. Visibility was nearly zero. Any carrier commander would have kept his lights off to avoid enemy attack. But Mitcher looked out into the storm and made his choice. "Turn on the lights," he ordered. "Bring our boys home." The horizon lit up with white and amber beacons. One by one, exhausted pilots found their way back, guided by the very lights that risked the ship. Some called it madness. To the men who survived, it was mercy. By the time Bunker Hill turned into the wind for the last recovery, the ocean was calm again. Only the faint smell of salt, smoke, and oil remained. In Tokyo, silence filled the war rooms. Reports were grim. The Japanese Navy was no longer a force, it was a memory. The Empire's admirals, once proud architects of victory, now spoke in whispers. "We cannot fight what we cannot outbuild," one said. The Essex carriers had done the impossible. They had not just fought battles, they had rewritten how wars were fought. And as dawn broke over the Pacific, their silhouettes stretched across the horizon like giants, gray against the golden sky. The mockery that once filled the air had long been buried beneath the waves. And the empire that laughed at the Essex carriers was gone. Tokyo Bay was quiet that morning, unnaturally so. The sea was smooth as glass, the air heavy with the scent of fuel and rust. On the horizon, a gray procession of American carriers loomed like steel mountains under a rising sun. Among them, the USS Essex stood in silent formation, her decks lined with sailors staring toward a small ship anchored ahead, the USS Missouri, where a table and two flags waited. It was September 2nd, 1945. Japan's surrender was minutes away. The empire that had mocked America's floating hotels was gone, and the ocean that once belonged to the rising sun now reflected the shadow of the Essex fleet. Below deck, engines idled softly. There was no cheer, no celebration. Only the low hum of machines and the weary breathing of men who had seen too much. Some had joined the Navy as boys and were now old before their time. Others stood with bandaged arms, watching history fold itself into silence. From the Essex's observation deck, a signalman peered through binoculars at the ceremony aboard the Missouri. When the Japanese delegation bowed and signed the instrument of surrender, he whispered to no one, "It's over. The storm's done." Yet in the quiet that followed, he felt no victory, only a hollow space where fear and adrenaline used to live. The Essex-class carriers had done more than win battles. They had reshaped the world. When the first hull was laid down in 1941, few could imagine that within 4 years, these ships would redefine the balance of power across the globe. 24 of them now stretched from Hawaii to the Philippines, guardians of a new era. Together, they had delivered over 2/3 of all U.S. Navy air operations in the Pacific. They had turned a war once ruled by Japan's precision into one dominated by America's production. And yet, their triumph carried a quiet irony. The same industrial power that ended the war would soon create weapons that made even the Essex look small. After the war, as the fires of Tokyo dimmed and the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned into memory, the carriers returned home. But they didn't fade into history. One by one, the Essex ships were refitted, modernized, reborn. Jet engines replaced propellers. Radar domes sprouted where anti-aircraft guns once stood. USS Oriskany, USS Ticonderoga, USS Hancock, all evolved into carriers of a new world, symbols of American reach during the Cold War. Some became training ships, others recovery vessels for NASA's Apollo missions. When USS Hornet lifted the Apollo 11 astronauts from the Pacific in 1969, her deck crew saluted not only the men from the moon but the ghosts of every sailor who had built the road to that moment. But for those who had lived through the Pacific War, the transformation felt bittersweet. The Essex-class had been born from desperation, from a time when America was cornered and humiliated. Their purpose had been revenge, their mission survival. Now they floated in peace, hosting parades and inspections instead of dogfights. To some veterans, that peace felt fragile. Lieutenant Evans, the same pilot who had once laughed hysterically after surviving his first night landing, returned years later to see his old ship docked in New York. He ran his hand along her hull and whispered, "You were supposed to die out there, old girl. Guess you fooled us all." He wasn't wrong. Of the 24 Essex-class carriers built during the war, 17 would go on to serve into the 1960s and 1970s. USS Lexington became a training ship, USS Yorktown a museum, USS Intrepid a national monument. These floating fortresses outlasted the empires they helped destroy. They had been mocked as cumbersome and excessive, yet they became the blueprint for every carrier that followed, from the Midway class to the nuclear-powered Nimitz giants that still patrol today. But victory always comes with its shadows. The sailors who survived often carried memories heavier than their medals. Deckhands who spent months scraping burned paint from bomb-scorched steel would wake at night to phantom explosions. Pilots who once called the Essex decks home now spoke of guilt. Not for what they'd done, but for how completely they had won. The Japanese fleet didn't just lose ships. It lost its identity. Centuries of naval tradition, crushed beneath waves of American industry. When the war ended, Japan's surviving officers were allowed to visit the captured ships. Some were stunned into silence. One admiral, standing on the deck of an Essex carrier anchored off Yokosuka, ran his hand along the deck plating and said quietly, "We could never have built this." There was no bitterness in his voice, only awe. For him, it was like touching the bones of a god he had once doubted. In the months that followed, the irony deepened. Japan, stripped of its imperial power, began rebuilding its navy, this time with guidance from the very nation it once sought to destroy. Their new carriers, smaller and defensive, would one day operate alongside American ships, including descendants of the Essex design. The mockery that had begun with laughter now ended in imitation. Back in the United States, the Essex fleet became symbols of permanence, gray, unyielding testaments to what could be achieved when an entire nation believed in the impossible. Shipyards that once built them were now silent, their tools cold. The workers who had forged those floating cities returned to lives that suddenly felt too quiet. Yet every rivet, every weld, every scar on the hulls still whispered of the moment when a country found its strength through sheer will. The Essex-class had changed warfare forever. No longer would battleships decide wars. No longer would nations measure power in guns and armor. From now on, dominance would come from the sky, from the ability to project destruction across oceans. It was a revelation that reshaped the world's military doctrine. Even the Soviet Union, once skeptical of carriers, began to study the Essex design, understanding that these ships were not relics but harbingers. As the years passed, one by one, the Essex carriers were retired. Some were scrapped, their metal melted down into the infrastructure of post-war America. Bridges, skyscrapers, even automobiles. Others were preserved, their decks now walked by tourists and schoolchildren. The laughter of visitors replaced the thunder of planes, but the decks still carried echoes of the past. Under the summer sun, oil stains shimmered faintly, scars that time refused to erase. In one corner of the USS Intrepid, a small plaque bears the names of her fallen crew. Beneath it, a single line reads, "They called it a hotel. It became their storm." That line, carved in bronze, carries the irony of the entire war, that arrogance had birthed its own destruction, and ridicule had turned to reverence. Even today, when modern supercarriers sail the Pacific with nuclear engines and computerized systems, the shadow of the Essex still follows. The design philosophy, redundancy, repairability, mass production, remains the cornerstone of American naval power. Every catapult launch, every arresting wire catch, every pilot's final approach traces its lineage back to those gray decks that once burned beneath Pacific skies. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all. Not just victory, but evolution. The Essex carriers proved that war rewards adaptability over pride, and humility over arrogance. They were proof that strength isn't born from perfection but from persistence, from learning, failing, rebuilding, and refusing to stop. When Admiral Mitcher died in 1947, his ashes were scattered at sea. The destroyer that carried them paused near where his fleet had once sailed. As the urn sank beneath the waves, the sailors on deck removed their caps in silence. One officer whispered, "He taught us to build storms." Somewhere deep below, among the wrecks of Japanese ships still resting on the ocean floor, the ghosts of that laughter lingered. But above them, the Essex fleet had written a different ending, one of endurance, rebirth, and irony so sharp it could cut steel. The Pacific no longer echoed with war drums. Only the sound of the tide remained, washing endlessly against history's forgotten shore. And so, the story ended as it began, with a ship too big to believe in, and a world too proud to see what it meant. They had called it a floating hotel. It became the foundation of an empire that still sails. Which modern machine, mocked today, will rewrite tomorrow's wars?